Hi, I'm Travers. This is the third video in a series of looking at how we can observe the subject of our drawing in such a way that it gives us the best chance of producing the best, most accurate drawing possible. In the first video, we looked at a really unfortunate habit that most of us can't help but have, which really makes it very difficult for us to produce a good drawing. In this third video, we're going to look at what I really think is the antidote to that problem that we have we talked about in the first video. And that problem was that when we look at something, we think we know what it is already. And so I look at a window that I'm drawing and go, oh, it's a window. And without looking carefully enough at the window, I go straight to my drawing and start to draw a window. Or I think, oh, it's a tree. I know what a tree looks like. And so we go straight and we draw this tree. Or it's a car. I know what cars look like. And we start to draw this tree. And unfortunately, the tree we're drawing, the car, the person, the house, the window, whatever it is, it's not the actual tree, window, person from the perspective in this particular scene, but it's a more generic version that we have in our head, or it's a simplified version, or it's just a not terribly accurate version, which is being fine for everything we want to do in life except draw. And we wonder then why our drawing doesn't look so much like the subject. And it's not because we've lacked the drawing skills, we've actually lacked the observation skills. So I'm trying to draw something that's not actually there, which is why it then doesn't look like it. So that's the problem we want to overcome with what we're looking at, the observational techniques in this video. So the way to stop seeing what we think is there and to actually start to see what really is there in the subject that we want to draw is to stop seeing things, it's to stop seeing the subjects. And instead of seeing a tree or a person or a house or a car, it's just to see lines and shapes and tones depending on what we're looking at and how we're going to draw it. It's to break things down into smaller parts that don't really make any sense by themselves. If a line or a shape doesn't make a great deal of sense by itself, then I have to pay a lot more attention to it when I draw it. And it's by doing this that we can escape that trap of thinking I know what it looks like. I'm forced to pay attention to how long is that line, how far is it from another line, how do things line up, what shapes, what angles, what is this rectangle looking like, and I have to reproduce that rectangle in my drawing of those proportions if it's going to be correct. All of these things, once we stop seeing objects that we already think we know how to draw them, and we look carefully at the individual lines and angles and shapes and seek to reproduce those, we'll find it much easier, in my experience, to get an accurate drawing of that subject. So, as always, this is often easier to see in practice in an example. So let's look at our first example. This building across the road from Windsor Castle has a series of columns supporting the upstairs room. Now the trick here is to firstly draw the first one very carefully because it's almost going to become like a ruler that we use to measure other distances in the drawing. Once it's in place, the trick is not to see this as columns, but to see these as lines that are certain distances apart, whether it's one side of a column or the other or the space between. Just see it all as spaces and lines and look carefully at the lines and the spaces and draw the lines, draw the spaces. The angles become things that we can measure. We're not thinking in terms of support at the top. We're just thinking in terms of an angled line. The ceiling that comes in underneath, again, not thinking of drawing a ceiling, but seeing it as a arrow shape that comes in from the left and seeking to duplicate that arrow shape in the right proportions. We have these arches. Again, we're not thinking of arches. We're looking at the dark spaces defined by the arches and seeking to recreate those as well. And then we put the fence into place. Now with the windows, very important not to think of windows, but to see the spaces between the lines where the windows have to go, and then draw the lines in that create the spaces that we need, both inside those lines and outside of those lines. And then for the windows, it's more lines that create certain rectangles of certain proportions inside each other. And so again, I'm not trying to draw a window, I'm trying to replicate the shapes that I see on my reference in my drawing. And really once that's done, that's in place, the whole structure is pretty much defined. And then it is more straightforward just to sit there and to add to add a few decorative flourishes. We can do things like the flowers and little decorative things once the overall structure is in place. It's the fun part, I often think. So did that make sense? It's a subtle idea in lots of ways if you're having trouble getting your head around exactly what I mean. So persevere with the next two examples, because that may just help it fall into place. I have found this so vital to try not to see the overall object and to be thinking, oh, this is that, but to look at lines and shapes and patterns, angles, and to seek to reproduce those. What this means is there's a constant looking back and forth from my reference photo to my drawing, from my reference photo to my drawing. If I'm drawing from life, from what's in front of me down to my drawing, what's in front of me down to my drawing. There's a constant back and forth, and if you're not actually constantly going back and forth, then probably you're not observing carefully enough. And if you never have the experience where you look, you go to draw, and you suddenly realize you don't know exactly where to put the line and you have to go back and look again without having drawn anything, you're certainly not observing carefully enough. I sometimes can look 3 or 4 times before I realize I've taken in all the information I need to put a line in the right position. Once I know where it has to go, I still need the skill to put that line in that place. But if I don't know where it's meant to go, I've got no chance. So let's look at our second example, and hopefully it'll make more sense after this example. Let's go. Here we are looking down on the spire of St James's Church in Sydney. Spires often present a problem when we're looking down, or more commonly looking up, because it distorts the view we normally have, looking straight at them from a distance. And it's very hard to get that preconception of how it looks straight on to not disrupt our drawing, not interfere with what we're actually seeing. So here I'm paying particular attention just to copy these very long, thin, triangular shapes all next to each other. I'm really seeing this as just copying shapes, not drawing a spire. And then when I get to the base of the spire, I'm doing the same thing with the sort of triangular type shapes where the spire splays out to the square tower. And once that's in place, it's the same principle with the tower itself. I'm not drawing a tower, I'm looking at my reference photo. It's a series of straight lines that are a certain distance apart, and I'm looking at doing that, at keeping all those lines in place. I'm not drawing a tower, I'm duplicating lines. So we're not drawing a spire. We're drawing a series of very long, thin triangles that sit next to each other, each one of them proportioned differently and with different angles at the bottom. But we're not thinking spire, we're thinking of the component shapes of the spire, and we're seeking to draw them, and we look at each of those separately because they're really each a quite separate shape. And then we seek to replicate those accurately, and it's the same with the tower. Okay, did it make sense with that example? Let's look at our third example. It's a more complicated structure. Let's go. Here we're drawing the decorative crown, stone crown on the top of St Giles's Church in Edinburgh. Now again, just being very careful with these first few lines, first few angles, because a lot will depend on getting those right. But this is a fairly complex structure. And so again, it's helpful not to think of it as drawing a tower with a crown decoration on top, but in our mind, keeping all the little parts separate and just concentrating on drawing it part by part rather than thinking it's this complicated whole and perhaps trying to draw too much all at once when we don't really have an accurate sense of the structure yet. Looking at it bit by bit means we can focus with some concentration on each small part and build the tower as a whole. And as we get more and more of it built, more and more of the drawing done, it becomes easier, it becomes faster, not quite this fast, but it becomes faster because we can see we have more reference points to work off. Now I did actually, that little part on the top left is drawn a bit large, and I realised that was a problem from the start, but I resisted the temptation to start again, because if you've listened to my video on making mistakes, one of the things I say is just push through. If we're forever starting again, we don't really learn, and we just stay focused on getting perfect instead of learning. So, but the more that's done, the more that we can put in. And then there's just these decorative finishes at the end. And I haven't tried to draw a tower. I've just looked at the lines and shapes, and bit by bit, I've added them into place. What do you think? So with a more complicated subject, there is a lot more back and forth between looking at the reference photo and looking at the paper. A lot of back and forth, but particularly at the start, we need to work hard to get it as accurately as possible, because what we draw first becomes the ruler that we measure the subsequent drawing from. So it's really worth paying particular attention. But it does mean that the pace picks up a little bit as we progress the drawing. So look, I hope this has been a helpful concept. Just try and apply it in the next drawing that you do. Try not to look at something and say, oh, that's a car. I can draw a car. But to look at the shapes, the lines, the angles, and seek to reproduce those shapes. You'll possibly find you'll draw the most accurate car you've ever drawn. And so, I mean, I have to draw cars that way because I have no great interest in cars. And so I've never actually observed them with enough attention to have any chance of drawing one if I'm not paying really careful attention. But I learned early on that the easiest way to draw something you don't know how to draw is simply to copy the lines. And then I learned, hey, it's actually the best way to draw everything. People are always asking me, how do you draw so accurately? And I truly think that it's because I've learned to observe a lot more carefully than perhaps most people observe. And so that sets me up then to use whatever actual drawing skills I have to do the best I can with them, because I know what I'm trying to draw. And that's why I'm producing this series on observing for drawing success, because I really think that these ways, these techniques of observing really will set you up for producing really lovely, accurate drawings. So look, I hope it's helpful. If it is helpful, if you try it and it's helpful, please leave a comment and tell me. That would be great. If you want to know when the next in this series comes out, hit the notifications bell, and then you'll know when the fourth one in the series comes out, which I don't think will be that far off. But in the meantime, keep drawing, have fun. Bye.